John D, thank you for your super chat. Re your interview with Megan today. Apparently, the Vatican claims Paul's tomb was found in Rome. Can you comment on this?
So you're referring to my podcast, Misquoting Jesus. And look, that for a long time, of course, it was believed that Peter's tomb was found. And uh, what do you say? How does one go about demonstrating that a tradition that you can trace back, even if you suppose you could trace a tradition back to the year 200, that this is so and so's tomb? Um, there were reasons why Christians in various cities claimed to have connections with apostles and claimed that the apostles founded the churches there, claimed that the apostles ministered there, claims the apostles died there, claims they have relics of the apostles. Because within Christianity, this gave you a sort of cachet as a church. It gave you more authority. Um, and in almost every instance, there's no historical verification of it. Um, there's no historical verification that Thomas went to India or that Mark founded the church in Alexandria. And there's surprisingly little evidence that Peter went to Rome, for example. We know that Paul wanted to go to Rome because in his letter to the Romans, he talks about wanting to use the Roman church as his base of operation for his mission to the west, as he wants to go to Spain. And he does go to Rome in the book of Acts, but the book of Acts is not overly reliable when it describes Paul's itinerary. In places where we can check against Paul, it's
Does,
often wrong.
can I stop you there? Does his
Yeah.
letter to the Philippians not mention the Praetorian Guard and Caesar's household?
Yeah, the Praetorian Guard simply doesn't necessarily refer to the being in Rome, um, and so maybe it does. Maybe the Praetorian Guard does, but Caesar's household doesn't refer to Rome. So I'll look at that passage in Philippians. It's been a long time since I don't think I read Philippians in 50 years. No, I'm just kidding. I'm joking. I'm joking. I'm joking. I need to look at the Praetorian Guard thing
I
because
just
that might be an argument, but I've never heard that. I'll have to look at that. In any event, suppose you've got some church that says this we've known for 100 years this is where Paul was buried. How do you verify it? You can't take DNA. I mean, you know what Paul's DNA looked like, and you can show that somebody was buried. It's kind of like the Shroud of Turin. Even if you can show that if somebody was crucified, okay, well that's nice. You can show like somebody crucified in the first century. Okay, so among the 100,000 people crucified in the first century, which one is this? So the question is verification, and I don't think that Vatican claiming something is evidence, and I don't think even a third century source is evidence. Um,
oh
I'm
darn.
sorry. So
No, but it's well
how
known.
would you know? I mean,
Yeah, no.
what do you do? You do you take out the tomb and find out whether he's decapitated or not? I mean, what do you do to demonstrate? Lots of people are decapitated in Rome as well. Plus, I don't think Paul was decapitated. Frankly, the idea that Paul was decapitated. Do y'all know the story about this? We're going overtime, but we're going. The Acts of Paul describes the martyrdom of Paul, and Nero's all ticked off because Paul's convincing people to follow Jesus instead of following Nero. Jesus is Lord instead of Nero being Lord. And so he decides to execute Paul. And Paul says, well, you can execute me, but you can't kill me because I'm going to come back and see you afterwards. And so Nero sends him off to the executioner. The executioner chops off his head with a sword. That that was reserved for Roman citizens. Okay, so apart from legendary accounts, Roman citizens, if they suffered capital punishment, were to be decapitated, because beheaded, because it was seen to be kind of the least painful of the bad options. And so Paul's decapitated because in the Acts of Paul, he's a Roman citizen. But in the Acts of Paul, his head gets lopped off and milk starts pouring out of his neck, not blood. What? Milk? And the author doesn't explain it, but I think it's because milk is what you feed newborns. And Paul now has been born again to his new life. And so he hasn't died. He's been brought back to life through his death. So that's the Acts of Paul. That's the first account we have of it. The other thing I'll say, though, is that in the book of Acts, Paul's also said to be a Roman citizen. And I don't think there's any evidence Paul was a Roman citizen. He doesn't say anything about it. I think it's highly unlikely that Paul was a Roman citizen. Um, he's a lower class. I mean, he works with his hands. He's not connected. Jews could be Roman citizens, but I don't think there's anything to suggest Paul was.
Isn't that about the
He
same
writes.
time
This
that,
I'm sorry.
okay, I was just gonna say, isn't that about the same time that we first hear about Paul died under Nero? Because you were mentioning earlier, the earliest account of his death is mentioned by First Clement, but even that text doesn't specifically claim it
Same
happened
point.
under Nero.
It doesn't
Right.
say. It doesn't say. And there are pretty good reasons for thinking Paul probably died in the 60s. I mean, he must have been in his 60s at that point. I mean, I think he was an adult when he converted. I don't think he was a teenager. If he converted around the year 33, then in the mid 60s, he'd be fairly well along. I mean, Seneca, who's living at the same time, when he's around, in his about mid 60s, he's talked about what an old man he is now, and that he expects to die soon. And that's kind of typical that you don't have long expectancies. I don't think Paul could have lived much beyond the 60s. I don't think there's good evidence that he was martyred by Nero, but this is the martyrdom of Paul which is probably part of the legendary Acts of Paul. It's circulated separately, but it probably is the first time that Nero is mentioned.
Seneca was certainly forced into suicide by Nero. I mean,
Yeah.
Seneca was a victim of Nero, even though had been a close associate of Nero's. And
Yeah, he had been his tutor and his advisor, and for many years, some years, and Seneca actually ran the empire apparently. But he, yeah, Nero didn't like his stoic ways. He didn't like his strict ethics, and so finally, when he got old, he just got rid of him.
he dies in 65. That gives us any
I
idea
think
about Paul. But Paul is a literate fellow. I mean, Paul does.
he's literate. He's
He
got an education.
So
Yes.
he's not, he does. The tradition again says he's, works with his hands, but do we really know much about Paul?
We don't know a lot. He himself indicates that he works with his hands. It's not just Acts, which says that works with leather, but
Right.
he talks about working with his hands day and night. And so it looks like he goes into places and sets up shop of some kind and is some kind of manual labor. And so he may be that he's what sociologists might call mixed status. So some people like Seneca have a very high status.
Right.
He's an equestrian. He's not a senator, but I guess he does end up joining the Senate. But he's not from the senatorial class originally, and he's one of the wealthiest human beings on the planet. Seneca is, and he's extremely high educated. Everything is a high level class status symbol. With Paul, it looks like it's a mixed bag because he's highly literate, which would make him at a higher status, and so he's educated. That's a high status thing, but he's also poor, which is low status, and works with his hands, which is low status. And so you have people like that are kind of mixed status. I mean, some people became highly educated because they were slaves.
Slavery couldn't. They hired Greek slaves to be their tutors for Roman aristocrats.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I've sometimes kind of casually wondered if one could make the argument that Paul started out as a slave. He certainly loves calling himself the slave of Christ. And it would explain his high literacy. I don't know. I just played with the idea. I'm not going to